welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and I am finally making a deck building guide, something that I have been asked about quite a bit on my channel, but I have avoided doing, and there's a very specific reason why I avoided doing it, because I really don't think it works. Everyone is looking for that one quick fix to help them make a deck, and there really isn't one. I know, of course, I've made a bunch of videos about how much lands you should be putting in your deck or how much removal, you should be doing this, you should be doing that. But at the end of the day, it comes down to personal choice. It comes down to what commander you're playing. It comes down to what play group you are playing in. There's so many factors involved. And if I sat here and gave you a template of exactly how many draw spells and removal spells and ramp spells and all of that you should be putting in your deck, well, it might not work for you. And you'll go play with your play group and they'll stomp your butt. And then you'll come back and comment on my video that I'm an idiot and I don't know what I'm talking about. There's so many little nuances involved in the Commander format, especially the casual part of the Commander format, that giving people rigid numbers for what they should be doing with their decks really doesn't work. And even more to the point, it comes down to personal choice of what you actually like doing. I got in a huge discussion in both the comments section and on my Discord about bounce lands and whether or not they're good in a Commander game, and it all comes down to personal decision, really. Yes, there's certainly upsides to bounce lands, and there are certainly downsides to them as well. If you are saying that bounce lands are unplayable, and I'm certainly not, and they're absolute garbage and you should never put them in your commander decks, well, you're just wrong, because of course there is upsides to having bounce lands in your deck. But if you're saying bounce lands should go in every commander deck because there's no downside, well, that person's wrong as well, because there obviously is a downside to them, right? There is no perfect answer. I think a lot of people right now are looking for the perfect answer for what you should be doing in your commander deck. I see lots of videos of guys going over the numbers. I actually had a guy asking me for evidence of why I should be doing this or that in my deck. I'm like, man, there is no evidence. It's all subjective. It's just personal opinion here. That's what I do on my channel, is I'm just giving my personal opinion. I see people trying to actually crunch the numbers on what makes the most sense as far as being the most efficient and all of that. At the end of the day, why does that matter, guys? We're playing casual commander here. I've maybe even gone overboard with regards to being super efficient when it comes to doing certain things, and I've realized, do we really need to be doing that? We're just playing casual commander. It doesn't matter how efficient you are. Just play the stuff that you like. But for the people that actually clicked on this video because they wanted some deck building advice on maybe how to get started in the commander format, if there is a person out there that exists that isn't already playing commander, I will give you some advice here, some general advice on what you should be doing in your commander deck without any rigid numbers. Again, most people have very rigid numbers of the things you should be doing in your commander decks. For me, it's just whatever works for you. Experience is more important than anything here, especially if you're coming from other formats. You really got to play a lot of commander or even just watch a lot of commander. I would say doing a combination of both will really help you to get a feel for what you should be doing. If you're looking for a starting point, though, for putting a commander deck together, I will give you a pretty good one here that I'm calling the 365 method, which is a pretty good launching point for making a deck in the commander format. And it's basically combining three of my videos, which are 3 methods for choosing your commander, 6 things every commander deck needs, and my 5 rules for deck building. Essentially, I'm taking those 3 ideas, combining them together to sort of make a deck building guide, although again, I don't particularly love that term. So let's start out with the 3. And what the 3 is talking about the methods for choosing your commander. That's where it starts. Of course, this is the commander format. We got to start with what's that guy that's going to be in the command zone. However, it might not actually start that way, and I'll explain why. There are certain methods for choosing your commander as well, and of course, the main method is I'm choosing a legendary creature that I want to build my deck around. That's how I would say most commander decks are put together, especially now with these commanders they're coming out with that you absolutely want to be building around them. Most people are using the first method for choosing their commander. This method, though, can further be broken down into two parts. I'll call them 1A and 1B. 1A is I need my commander. I'm building around my commander so much that I absolutely need it to be in play in order for my deck to do anything. What I refer to as a monolith commander build. So that means my deck really doesn't do much if my commander's not in play. My advice is to avoid those builds. However, sometimes it can be fun. I recently put together one myself, my Lanesta deck, which is building around the grandeur ability. And of course, because I only have one card in the entire deck with the grandeur ability, there only is one blue card that has the grandeur ability after all, my commander. Obviously, I need my commander in order for my deck to really do a whole lot. And in fact, the deck is entirely built around just trying to use the grandeur ability. So of course, I need my commander. Therefore, it is a monolith build. So even I have decks that do that, although I tried to avoid it. 1B would be more, I'm very much building around what my commander's doing. However, I'm not entirely screwed if my commander's not in play like an Atraxa deck, right? I'm putting an Atraxa deck together. Obviously, it's proliferating. So I'm doing counters, right? I'm just putting lots of stuff in my deck that I want to be proliferating. Maybe I'm doing Super Friends, something like that. Okay, well, obviously, I'm building around my commander there, but if my Atraxa gets killed, still got a bunch of Planeswalkers in play, no problem. My deck can very much still do its thing. So there is a way to build a Method 1 deck around a commander without making it a monolith build. Method 2 is I have an idea first and then I'm choosing my commander, right? So you just come up with an idea for your deck that you want to be doing. And of course, back in the day, it was way more common that this happens. So for example, I made a cycling deck way back in the day. I used Niv Mizzet, the original Niv Mizzet, as my commander because of course, cycling is pretty good in blue and red. And also when you cycle, you draw a card. So I was getting that card draw trigger. That's why I chose it as the commander. But of course, now we have dedicated cycling commanders. You still can't do that though. But of course, the Method 2 is used a lot less for ideas like that. People used to use Child of Alara for their Maze's End deck because it was just a board wipe in the command zone. That is how Method 2 works. I have an idea for a deck. I want to make a Maze's End deck, and I'm just finding a commander that fits that theme. Obviously, Child of Alara is not necessarily a Maze's End commander, right? Maybe my commander is just synergizing with what I'm doing. My Tishana deck was like this. It was very much a Method 2 deck. I just really wanted to build a Simic Blinking deck. Lots of really good value-y ETB creatures in Simic colors, and I chose Tishana because, of course, it's the colors I'm looking for, and it also has a pretty fantastic ETB, right? Draws me a bunch of cards. It also wants me to have lots of creatures in play, so even further fit that theme, right? That's the Method 2 way of doing things is I have an idea for a deck I want to make, and I'm trying to find a commander that fits, and hopefully I can find a commander that fits, right? Because sometimes you can't, believe it or not, even printing 300 commanders a year, sometimes you will still run into this problem, which brings us to Method 3, which is I just want to build a certain deck and there isn't really a commander that fits, so I'm just picking any old commander that I don't ever plan on using. I was just talking about this with a patron on Discord, about how you can just throw any 5-color commander in the command zone just because you want access to all colors, and maybe you're not even playing all colors. Maybe you're only playing 3 or 4 colors, and you have no plan to actually cast your commander. Absolutely, you can do that. Nothing saying you can't. That is the Method 3 way of doing things, is I have that commander, or maybe those partner commanders. Often a lot of people will put partner commander decks together just because they want those 4-color combinations, don't really care about what their commanders are doing. Maybe they'll cast them, maybe they won't. They could easily go the entire game, obviously, without casting their commanders, because what is in the command zone didn't fall into their equation at all outside of, I want to play those certain colors. That is what Method 3 is. Let's move on to 6 things that every commander deck needs. So here is the 6 things. Number 1, ramp. Number 2, card draw. Number 3, removal. Number 4, graveyard hate. Number 5, protecting your stuff. And number 6, and that's right, land destruction, something you absolutely need. Now, of course, land destruction is technically removal, but it is something very specific that you need to include in your deck that I decided to separate from just regular old removal. I have made a video about ramping in the Commander format. You can go check that out. Obviously, this discussion falls into 2 categories. When you're talking about green, you're basically in a completely different conversation than everything else because, of course, green does ramping really well, right? Just going and getting those lands and putting them directly into play is super easy in green. So there's the green discussion and then everybody else. White is also pretty good at getting lands into play. In fact, it's really the only other color that gets lands into play. And then outside of that, we are pretty much just playing mana rocks or the colorless options. Cards like Solemn Simulacrum and Sword of the Animist have been very common commander staples for a long, long time because those are great colorless options for getting lands into play. But if you want me to go more in depth on ramping, go check out my ramping video. Card draw is a really important one, and this is probably the one thing that I noticed the most when I first started playing the commander format. I was watching games all the time, and again, this is something that I recommend to you if you're new to the commander format. As I'm watching these games, I notice, man, these guys empty their hands really fast, right? I was coming from Modern, and guess how often people are playing draw spells in Modern? They're not. Like Preordain and Ponder were really popular Modern draw spells, but of course they don't really draw anything. They only draw one card. It's essentially a cantrip. Refilling your hand all the time is something that is fairly unique to the commander format, and mostly because you're just doing lots of stuff, right? One removal spell ain't good enough. We'll get more to that. I need a bunch of removal spells because of course I have 3 opponents. Ramping is also something that's not very common in other formats, so of course that's taken up a bunch of space in my deck, and it's taken a bunch of space up in my opening hand, right? I actually want to see some ramp spells in my opening hand, but of course that means I'm going to be emptying my hand a lot faster, so refilling your hand is really, really important. And of course, you can do that in other ways, not just card draw. You can, like, say, cast Creeping Renaissance and just get a whole bunch of cards back from your graveyard, right? There are other ways to do it, so I guess you could just refer to this as refilling your hand. You need to be doing that in a commander game in one way or another. You have to have some way to be putting cards into your hand. Typically, that is going to be card draw. It really is, I think, the most important thing in any commander deck for a number of reasons. Because first of all, it gets you to the things you need, right? You don't like playing tutors because you don't think they're very casual? That's fine. Draw 20 cards and you'll likely get to the card, or for sure, you will be increasing the chances you get to the card that you want in your deck, right? You don't like filling your deck full of removal, but of course you need it. That's okay. If I'm drawing tons of cards, I will eventually draw into my removal, right? So putting lots of card draw in your deck actually allows you to put less of those other things in your deck because of course it's going to increase the chances you get to it. Again, I made a video about drawing cards in Commander if you want a more in-depth discussion there. Removal is a big one for me, of course, something I've advocated for a bunch on my channel. I say all the time, removal wins games. People need to be putting more removal in their decks. I just learned very early on in the Commander format that it was really the great equalizer, and especially if you want to be playing really casual decks and you're playing against guys that are playing more higher end or high powered cards or powerful decks, that was the great equalizer. Rhystic Study and Smothering Tithe are really powerful and also really expensive cards in the Commander format, but both of them are easily removed by 2-mana instant speed spells that cost like 5 cents. People might laugh at you in today's meta for playing a Disenchant or a Naturalize in your Commander deck, but when you're blowing up their Rhystic Study or their Smothering Tithe, they're not going to be laughing anymore, right? I have made dozens of videos about removal. There is so much to talk about there. Of course, versatility is most important here. Just putting a bunch of board wipes that kill creatures in your deck is not good enough. You gotta be able to get rid of artifacts, you gotta be able to get rid of enchantments, and yes, you even need to get rid of lands, which I will get more to, of course. The eternal debate is spot removal or board wipes. A lot of people will advocate for one or the other. Again, it just comes down to personal choice. You guys like board wipes more. You have a play group where they're always complaining because you board wipe too much, so maybe you avoid playing board wipes, right? It comes down to all these little nuances in the casual Commander format. I'm not going to sit here and tell you you need this many spot removal spells and you need this many board wipes. Now, you just play whatever you think works for you. If the guys in your play group just happen to be playing lots of aggro-y decks, they're playing Edgar Markov or Krenko, you probably want lots of more board sweepers. In fact, you probably want some fast ones. Maybe even a Pyroclasm, a card that really doesn't see much play in the Commander format, might actually work really, really well in your particular playgroup because you have guys in your playgroup that are playing lots of little aggro-y decks with lots of token creatures and stuff like that, right? So figure out what works best for you, but likely putting more removal in your deck will be a good thing. All right, next up, protecting your stuff is super, super important in the Commander format. that protection is essentially the inverse of removal. That same guy who's watching this video, who's going to put more removal in his deck, he's going to be removing your stuff too, right? And when he goes to naturalize your Smothering Tithe, you can cast a Blacksmith skill and save it, right? That's what I'm talking about with protecting your stuff. A lot of people probably will bring up counter spells here. They sort of fit into two categories. Counter spells sort of fit into the removal category because it's like removing a spell, but also they fit into the protecting category because, of course, I can use an offer you can't refuse to counter my opponent's board wipe. I would say protection is better here. Of course, if I cast a heroic intervention in response to my opponent's Wrath of God, well, I'm going to get to keep all my stuff and nobody else is. If I just countered their Wrath of God, then everyone gets to keep their stuff. So it is a huge advantage and in a lot of cases better than a counter spell. Just countering everything your opponents are doing isn't necessarily a good thing, right? I can't count how many times I've seen someone cast a heroic intervention or a Teferi's protection in response to a board wipe and it's pretty much game over after that. They have such a massive advantage now, especially later in the game, that nobody can catch up to them. Especially if you have really important pieces in your deck, maybe your commander, maybe stuff in the 99 that you don't want to see go to the wayside. Make sure you put protection spells in your deck. And yes, if you're in certain colors, like say maybe red or black, it can be tougher to do, but there are again some pretty good colorless options. Like of course the best one being equipment to protect your creatures like a Commander's Plate or a Lightning Greaves, right? That's why those cards are so popular in the format. It's just a great colorless option to keep your commander on the board. All right, moving on, let's talk about Graveyard Hate. And this is one that is, in my opinion, way too often missed. A lot of these things I've already talked about are kind of super obvious, right? Ramp and card draw and removal. Of course you want to be doing that. Graveyard Hate is one that I think gets missed way too often, and a lot of people will just put their deck together and not even realize that they haven't put Graveyard Hate in there, and then they'll end up playing against that deck, right? We all know that deck, that Marin deck, that Muldrotha deck. I mean, just go down the list of really powerful commanders that want to be using graveyards, or just strategies that want to be using graveyards. I'm not particularly a graveyard guy myself, but man, I gotta have at least 5 or 6 decks that would be absolutely ruined if somebody had a Leyline of the Void in play. You really, really need Graveyard Hate, and it doesn't have to be a Leyline of the Void. It doesn't have to be a Rest in Peace. Some people will say those cards are a little unfun because it does completely shut down the graveyard deck, and that guy doesn't have an opportunity to do anything. The one shot is usually good enough. A Bojuka Bog or a Scavenger Grounds are your best options because, of course, they're lands they can very easily slot into your decks. Every single one of my black decks has a Bojuka Bog in it. I have never made a commander deck that was black that did not have Bojuka Bog. And Scavenger Grounds, not always because it does exile all graveyards, but Scavenger Grounds is an almost always for me in a non-black deck. If you're in a graveyard theme as well, it can hurt a little bit, but sometimes it's worth it, right? Sometimes the other guy is even more of a dedicated graveyard deck, and I'm going to pull the trigger on that Scavenger Grounds anyway, even though it does kind of hurt me. I would say ideally you want to have at least 2 options for Graveyard Hate in your deck. Just putting a Bojuka Bog or a Scavenger Grounds in there is not good enough. Remember, guys, we are in a 100-card singleton format here. The chances you draw that card are pretty slim. If you have a way to tutor for it, great. If you don't, probably want to put a few options in your deck because it is absolutely needed in any commander deck. All right, the last thing here is land destruction. I know, what, land destruction? In the commander format, I thought that was a faux pas. Targeted land destruction is an absolute must, and I mean an absolute must in any commander deck. That's why I separate it from just normal removal, because again, it's one of those things that you might skip over. And I just made a video about this, talking about how it is the most underrated thing or underplayed thing maybe in the entire format. People don't do it enough. There is so many powerful lands out there, like a Cabal Coffers or a Gaia's Cradle, that just give you so much mana. The game's just going to take off for you. There are cards like Glacial Chasm or Maze of Ith that will shut down your attacking strategy. And there are just a lot of really powerful non-basic utility lands out there that just have such a powerful effect, and if you don't have an answer for them, you're going to be in big trouble. It is such an easy thing to do in any commander deck to throw in a Ghost Quarter, or throw in a Strip Mine, or throw in a Wasteland, a Tectonic Edge. If you're looking for budget options, there's lots of those too. Demolition Field, Field of Ruin. Every deck should have at least one of those, maybe two. And then on top of that, having another option like a Beast Within, or a Generous Gift, or maybe even a Chaos Warp to hit your opponent's lands is pretty nice as well. Make sure you have at least a couple of these options in all your commander decks. All right, let's end off with my 5 rules for commander deck building, which again was in itself kind of a deck building guide a little bit when I first made it. And I basically just threw a bunch of things in there that I thought were important for making a commander deck. Let's start with rule number 1 for me, which is don't make yourself a target. One of the biggest things I learned when I first started playing the Commander format is that the multiplayer aspect is crucial. You're not the only opponent for your opponents, right? They have other opponents. So that means if they have a removal spell in their hand, well, who are they going to use it on? They're going to use it on whatever the biggest threat is at the table. And if you have a Ristic Study and I have, say, an Insight, a pretty good card draw option that I recently talked about on a 10 cards video, guess where that Beast Within is going? It's going towards the Ristic Study because that card is more of a target. I know people will say, yeah, but it's a really good card. Listen, this is the way I build decks, guys. I avoid cards like that because they are removal magnets. So not only are you losing your card, but you're also getting rid of that removal spell in your opponent's hand without having it being used on you. It's a double advantage for you, in my opinion, to not be playing cards like that. If you are playing cards like that, go nuts, but you better be getting a lot of advantage out of them. That's sort of the mentality I have here. But of course, the mentality of not making yourself a target first starts, of course, in the command zone. Everybody knows the commander you're playing right out of the gate. Obviously, that's the knowledge that every player has immediately before the game even starts. So if your commander is Tergrid or Najeela, well, guess what's going to happen in this game, right? Don't be surprised, at least. Again, if you're a newer commander player and you see Najeela and you're like, oh, cool, I want to make a 5-color warrior deck, do not be surprised at all if all of a sudden everyone is after you right out of the gate. I think it's a huge disadvantage. That's my mentality, and the main one. I avoid really powerful cards that are removal magnets, and I avoid really powerful commanders that are going to make me a target right out of the gate. It's just a huge disadvantage, isn't it? Isn't it a huge disadvantage for it to be arch enemy on turn 1? I think it is. So I just avoid really popular or really powerful commanders all around. It is such a huge advantage to me to show up to a game and the commander that I have sitting in the command zone is something no one's ever even seen before. Hey, what is that? They're not going to be paying attention to you. I assure you, that makes for a big advantage in a commander game. Let's get to maybe one of my most controversial opinions. And again, it's something that is just argued about forever on the internet with regards to commander deck building, and that's the amount of lands you put in your deck. Probably one of my more controversial opinions. Again, you got guys out there crunching the numbers, figuring out with their calculator what is the right amount of lands to put in your deck so that you can draw a land efficiently and make land drops and all that. Man, it's a casual format. I don't really care about all that, okay? There is no perfect formula to figure out the amount of lands you want in your deck. You just play the deck and then figure out what works for you. Some people really like to make land drops every single turn. I think that's a little silly. You don't need to make land drops every single turn, do you? In a casual game, on turn 10, you need to be making land drops? I don't know if that's necessary. Missing one once in a while is okay. Obviously, in turn 1, 2, 3, and 4, you definitely want to be making your land drops. Although I will say, the guy sitting there mana screwed who can't do anything is very much following rule number 1, right? Nobody's going to be going after that guy. I can't count the amount of commander games I've played where a guy's sitting there mana screwed for the first few turns, doing nothing, and the other guys completely ignore him and beat each other up, and then that guy comes back to win the game later on because everyone's ignoring him. Again, this is casual commander, guys. Anything is possible. That's why putting in these rigid rules for what you should be doing in a commander deck really just don't work. Brackets, I'm looking at you, by the way. Anyway, back to lands. For me, it's 34. I know people think that's absolutely insane. It works for me. And no, that does not include MDFCs, by the way. That's how many lands I put in my commander decks. The reason why is because mostly, and in fact almost entirely, I just don't want to be drawing a bunch of lands. You know what's worse than being land screwed? Land flooded. Because if you're just sitting there drawing lands every single turn, you're literally doing nothing. At least if I have 2 or 3 lands in play, I can do a lot with that. In fact, I have a lot of decks that can probably do okay with only 3 lands in play. You can still play your mana rocks, you can still likely play your commander, you can probably play most of your removal spells. You can do a lot with 3 lands in play in a commander game. I'm not saying it's great, I'm saying you will still be doing stuff. If all you're drawing is lands, you're literally doing nothing. Again, something I've seen a bunch is dudes just drawing lands off the top, playing the land, and then passing turn. That doesn't seem very fun, right? I just really don't like drawing lands off the top later in a game, and people might wonder, where did I get that 34 number from? Well, it's pretty simple, really. It's 1/3 of your deck. You got 99 cards in your deck, 1/3 of that should be lands, in my opinion, which of course is 33. I found 33 was maybe a little low, although again, it does depend on your deck. I have some decks with a really low mana curve where I only have 32 lands. I also, again, if I'm playing green, will tend towards less lands because of course I don't need to be making land drops every turn because I'm ramping so much. I found 33 was a little low for the average commander deck, so I bumped it up to 34. This isn't a discussion that you could just argue about literally forever. I use what works for me. I find 34 works a lot. If you have a really high mana curve, and a lot of people put like 5 9-drops in their commander decks, I mean, if you're one of those guys, then yeah, maybe you do want to be making a land drop every single turn, or maybe you just need to be putting more ramp in your deck. I'm not sure. 34 lands works for me in almost all cases, so that's what I go with. And I will end off with talking about versatility in your deck building. And for me, this is a big one that is probably the least obvious one. Again, there's a lot of things I talked about in this video that are probably super obvious. This one is the least obvious. Now, what does this mean, versatility in deck building? It means a couple of things. First of all, it means don't be too obvious, okay? Again, it's a huge advantage in a commander game if people don't know what you're doing, right? If you sit down at a table and some guy's playing an Arcades the Strategist deck, well, I guess we know what he's doing, right? He's playing a Walls deck. I mean, I guess it's a possibility he's not, but I'm not sure how you could possibly play that commander without playing a Walls deck, or I guess Defender Tribal, right? If I sit down beside someone playing an Atraxa deck, okay, well now I'm not so sure what they're doing. That is an advantage for them. I will say they are breaking rule number 1 by playing the most popular commander in the entire format, but I don't actually know what they're doing. Likely they're doing Super Friends, Infect, or some sort of +1/+1 counters theme, but maybe they're not. Maybe they're doing level counters, right? So it's a huge advantage for you to be playing a commander where your opponents don't really know what you're doing. It's also a huge advantage for you to play a theme where your opponents don't know what you're doing. If you're just playing cards and your opponents are going, I don't get it, what's going on there? Again, they're probably not going to pay much attention to you and they aren't going to know how to react. I mean, guys, there are commanders in this format that people will just hang on to their counter spells waiting for you to cast them. Do you want to be that guy? I mean, I would never do that. I don't typically waste my counter spells on someone's commander, but there are commanders in this format that people hate so much, or that people know your strategy is completely demolished if you don't have them. Again, getting back to the whole monolith commander thing, that they'll just hang on to their counter spell, wait till you cast your commander, and then counter your commander to set you back a couple turns. So it is a combination of rule number 1 of not being a target, but also the monolith build where my opponent doesn't know what to do. They don't know where to send their removal. They don't know what to use their counter spells for on me because I'm doing this thing that they've never seen before. This also can be integrated into just your deck collection in general, right? I've talked to guys that have like 7 Golgari decks and they're all graveyard decks. Like, what, your decks are all doing the same thing? That's kind of boring. I mean, I guess if you really like that, on top of the fact that it's boring, it's also super obvious. Oh, look, it's Johnny. He's playing another graveyard deck. That guy that does that same thing all the time. I guess I'll just put Leyline of the Void or Rest in Peace in all my decks and he'll never have any fun, right? It's just really easy to hose you as a person in general. If you have a bunch of decks that all do different things, then it's a lot harder for people, particularly in your playgroup or your LGS, to build against you. Oh, I'm going to put a ton of graveyard hate in all my decks because that's going to screw this guy over. Oh, well, hold on. I only have like 1 or 2 graveyard decks. The rest of my decks don't care about graveyard at all, right? I have some decks that are specifically built around my commander. I have some decks that aren't really built around my commander at all. Diversifying how you build your decks is a pretty big advantage for you in a commander game as well, I think. and also just kind of makes things a little more interesting so you're not always bringing the same decks to every game, right? I'm going to end it there. That's about it for deck building advice from me in a singular video as far as deck building guide, heavy on the quotations there. Just saying you got to put this amount of draw spells in your deck or you got to put this amount of spot removal in your deck is just so incredibly vague, and it doesn't even take into account at all your play group or what commander you're playing, all that kind of stuff. Like I've said before, if your commander's Tatyova, how many draw spells are you putting in your deck? I don't think you're putting any. Your ramp spells now become your draw spells. As I say all the time, you need to be synergizing with what your deck is doing. Nature's Claim is a fantastic artifact enchantment removal spell, one of the best in the format, but if I'm playing an ETB deck, I might swap that out for a Reclamation Sage, because of course that's a creature with an ETB, so I can likely get more than one use out of it, right? So there's all sorts of little nuances like that as well. Always pick the cards that fit the theme of what your deck is doing, I guess is more advice that I can give to you as I head out the door here. That is it for today though, and thanks for tuning in.